Hello G2, if you don't know me, my name is Hannah. I'm the leader here at G2 and it's really exciting to be back meeting in small groups after our short break over the summer. I'm really aware that there's been some changes to small groups, so as you're sat together now and watching this video, you might be with some new people, you might have changed groups, that people might have joined you, or you might have not changed all that much, but maybe some people have moved on from your group to another group. But I think there's been changes in pretty much all of the groups in one way or another. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that to start with, that brings sort of a fresh start feeling with it, especially in September, as we tend to kind of run our year academically, so from September through to July. So it's kind of a start of a new year, and this is the first of our small groups for this year kind of thing. And before we get into our passage today and get into our content, I just thought it'd be good to remind us of why we gather like this in small groups, why we're still doing Matthew, and what the whole vision is behind that. So if you were at G2 like last Sunday, or maybe you've caught up online, I shared what I think is the vision for G2 for the next 5 years, and that is that we'd be a place where all of us are on a journey to discover. And that looks like all sorts of different things, but we want to be discovering more about the Bible, more about who we are, more about who God says we are, more about each other, more about what it means to pray and what it means to worship. But fundamentally, discovery is so important, as that's where we really encounter fruit, I guess, like that. As we discover, then we go deeper, and things really like stay firm in our hearts than if we're just told something or taught something. And then we also are called to live for Jesus. So our discoveries take us into a place of discipleship. We are disciples. We don't just believe in Jesus, but we follow him, and we are all on this like discipleship journey together. There's no hierarchy. There's no one is better than the other in the world of disciples. In fact, the disciples in the Bible argue about that all the time. And it's just not a case. Like we're just all on this journey of learning and growing and being more like Jesus, and we really want to be a place where transformation happens through the power of the Holy Spirit, through prayer, through spending time with the Spirit. That's where kind of the things that entangle us can really be thrown off, but only through the Spirit, not through our own works. And then out of that, we hope that turns into a people where we share our faith, where it's really apparent to see the work of Jesus in us, and others are drawn to that, and therefore it's a place where we can tell others and share the good news. So discover, live, tell. And I also shared that our culture is word, spirit and love. So we want to be filled with abounding love. We want to hold firm to the word, and we want to receive a fresh supply of the Spirit. And so as we looked at all that, then we know we can't do everything on a Sunday. That isn't possible. We can't like live as disciples and really be equipping each other and spending time in the presence of the Lord and really getting to grips with the word. Or we can't do everything on a Sunday. And so our small groups are just as important as our Sunday gatherings. And it is here that we really are focusing on the word. This is where we kind of go deeper in the word. There is some teaching, but there's also a chance to discover for yourself, to discuss, to engage in it, to ask questions, to learn from one another. It's also a place where we can spend time in the Spirit and really be living out how to love each other as well. But I think the real key things that we want to see in our small groups is discover and word, and we hope that that's what happens. And we started doing Matthew last September. I just felt that was kind of prompted from God, just start at the start of the New Testament. So started with Matthew, and we're up to chapter 17. We're going to go all the way to the end, however long that takes. But that doesn't mean that we're only staying in Matthew. That like what happens is Matthew, as we look at this book, we often jump around to to other parts of the Bible as well, because it's all one story. And so we're not only looking at this gospel, we're drawing from other places as we look at it. So hopefully we don't feel like, oh, we're still doing Matthew. We should be going deeper and learning lots together. Anyway, let's get into our content today. So a few years ago, my son Morgan, who is now 11, I think he was in year 2 at the time, and I picked him up from school. And at the time, I don't know if you've ever, if you remember being at school and it being like this, or if you pick up from school, you have to, all the parents sort of gather in this crowd outside the classroom, and then the teacher comes out with all these kids lined up behind them, and then the teacher slowly releases the children to the parents one by one, obviously to make sure every child gets to their parent safely. And when my son Morgan got to the front of the queue, the teacher, Mrs. Bolton, she sort of released him to me, but she also said, can I have a quick word, please? So, feeling like, the naughty parent, I had to stand there while she continued to release all the other children. There was no kids left. And then she had a little chat with me. And what she told me was that at the end of the day, when she was saying to the kids, get your bags, get your coats and everything, she said to the whole class, make sure you put your coats on. Now, Morgan looked at the weather outside and he decided that he didn't need to wear a coat. And so he didn't put his on. She spotted that he didn't put it on, and so she said to him again, Morgan, can you make sure you put your coat on, please? And then she turned away and did some other stuff. And when she looked again, he still hadn't put his coat on. And so she was quite cross with him for disrespecting her and not putting his coat on. The problem that I had with this scenario is, as me and Mrs. Bolton were standing there having this conversation, it was a fairly warm autumn day. And neither of us were wearing coats. And the way that I've raised my kids is for them to be as independent as possible. Like every morning, even now, they say to me, do I need a jumper? Do I need a coat? And always my answer is, it's up to you. It's entirely up to you. You have the means to figure out what the weather's going to be today. And you have the ability to make the decision, do I need to wear a coat in that kind of a weather? And so Morgan was really just being sensible in looking out the window and thinking, I don't need to wear a coat today. It's not particularly warm. But that Mrs. Bolton had decided that all kids should wear a coat at the end of the day, regardless of the weather. And so I apologised and told her that I would have a little chat with Morgan and would make sure he understands the rules. But the reality is, as we walked home, I said to him, Morgs, listen, this is a silly rule. It doesn't make any sense at all. You absolutely can decide if you want to wear a coat or not. But while you're in her class, you just need to put your coat on. That's just what you need to do. There's no point creating any dramas or any issues here. Just put the coat on. And literally, as soon as you leave the classroom and you get to me, you can take your coat off again and we can deal with it. But let's just not create any problems. And so that's what he's continued to do for the rest of his school times. And so as we go into our discussion now, I wonder, do you have a similar experience? Do you have any rules that you have had to follow that, in your opinion, don't really make any sense? You think maybe they're a little bit silly or annoying, or even at some point maybe that rule made sense, but now it doesn't make sense. Maybe from your own school days or university days or in the workplace. I know there's some crazy rules in the workplace. So just a little discussion to get us started in your groups now. So we're looking at an encounter today in Matthew where somebody asks Peter if Jesus follows a particular rule. And just on face value, this could be quite a mundane interaction that we might question, why has this made it into Matthew's gospel? Somebody asks Peter a question, he answers the question, fairly straightforward. But Jesus uses this as a significant teaching point for Peter, for the other disciples, and also for us, which means it did get included in the gospel. And so let's open our Bibles now. We're going to have a look at Matthew 17. We're going to read from verse 24 until the end of the chapter. And I'll get you to pause the video in a minute and do this in your groups. Now, this might just be me. You might not find this at all, but I found this to be one of those parts of scripture that I needed to read a couple of times before I began to understand what it was about. And even then, even after a couple of times, I felt like Jesus is slightly speaking in riddles, and it wasn't entirely obvious to me what this really was. So if that's how you find it, don't worry about that at all. We're going to unpack it together. But B, if you've got a pen or a pencil, highlighter, anything, you might find it useful just to underline anything that doesn't make sense to you, write down any questions you have, and then just spend a bit of time as a group talking about those questions. See what you can discover together, see what other people know, or just, have a discussion about those things. So after you've read that part of Matthew, and had a little discussion, then you might also find it helpful to read Exodus 30, verse 11 to 16, and see what you make of it, and see if you can see the link between that part of the Old Testament and this part of the New Testament. Well, I don't know about you, but the first question I had when I read that is, how do you say the name of that place where they are right at the start of that Matthew reading? I have always said it Capernaum or Carpenaum, but apparently it's Capernaum, and so that's something I learned this week. So what we've got here is two stories are meeting. So we've got two separate contexts that are meeting in this part of Matthew. And I think it's really important that we understand the background and the context of both of those stories. So the first story is the story of the temple tax. And now you might have seen the link between the tent tax that we see in Exodus and the temple tax that's here in the New Testament. So you probably know that Exodus is the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt to the promised land. And then they have to wait for 40 years for that promised land. It's, the story of the Ten Commandments and the burning bush and all sorts of things that we probably know about. And Exodus 26 describes the tent or the tabernacle in great detail. So if you want to know what this tent or tabernacle was, that is the place, because the Lord gives instructions on how it should be built. And I'm going to put an image on the screen now so that you can see it. But what we know is that it was 45 feet long, it was 15 feet wide, it was 15 feet high, and it was a wooden skeletal structure overlaid with gold, and it had no solid roof or front wall. And the frame was covered in 4 layers of cloth and silk. Inside it, there was a curtain that separated the most holy place, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And it was here that Yahweh would descend to meet with his people. Now, like I say, the Lord gave very clear instructions to Moses on how it should be made, and that this would be a place where the Lord's presence would reside. That was in the instructions. Now, this happened after Moses was given the 10 Commandments, and as he was up on Mount Sinai, encountering God, encountering Yahweh, getting those 10 Commandments, he came down and discovered that the Israelites had once again turned away from God and had built a golden calf to worship. And in his rage at this, Moses had smashed those tablet stones on which the 10 Commandments had been written. Now, God then helped Moses to engrave the new tablets again and instructed him to build this Ark of the Covenant to keep them in, and instructed Moses to build a tabernacle to keep the Ark in. Now, I personally do not believe that God needed or wanted a tabernacle. His presence was and is everywhere, and he longs for us to worship with all of our hearts. However, I think this is a really good example of how God meets us, the people, where we are. And the people, the Israelites, they wanted something solid to worship. They were really struggling without something solid, which is why they then went and built this golden calf to worship. They wanted a place where they could go. They wanted something earthly, material. So God gave them what they wanted or what they needed so that they could worship him. Okay, so that's a bit of background to the context of Exodus 34, first of all. And here we see that the Lord instructs Moses on collecting this tent tax. So it's been a while, and the Lord then gives Moses these instructions, and it's to be collected from all males over the age of 20. And we can see that the Lord says it's the price of a person's life, that's why they're paying it, for their own life. Now, I could go down that rabbit hole, but I'm not going to today. The Lord also says to spend it on the upkeep of the tent, which, to be fair, after a few years, is going to need some work. It's going to need repairing. It's going to need some fresh wood, skin, cloth, all those things. And so the instruction was that this should be paid at the census, which would really only be once in a lifetime for them. And so now back to Matthew 17, it's now called the temple tax, because when the Israelites finally reached the promised land, which was Canaan, it resided there, and then it was taken to Jerusalem, where Solomon later in the Old Testament built a temple for it. And the temple had a similar layout to the tabernacle. So the Ark of the Covenant then went into the temple. It had a curtain separating the most holy place, things like that. So this tradition of this tent tax from Exodus, from the Old Testament, the times of Moses, became temple tax. Except it became a bit of a controversial issue, and there's quite a lot of disagreement over it. Some people thought everyone should pay this tax. Some people thought it should still be men over the age of 20 and they should pay it on behalf of their families. There was discussion about whether you should just pay it once in a lifetime or maybe it should be an annual thing, which is what where it had landed. It was usually paid at Passover, but people disagreed with that. They felt like you should pay it at Passover, but then once you've paid it, you never pay it again, whereas some people thought every Passover this should be paid. And it all sounds fairly mundane to me, political discussion about tax, but apparently it was a very, very hot topic back in the first century. And more importantly, it was a divisive topic. It was causing fallout and upset because people had really strong opinions on it. And so it was splitting the Jewish families and the Jewish population. Okay, so that's our context of the temple tax. Now let's just think about our context of Peter in this story. So back in Matthew 16, Peter was the first of the disciples to name Jesus as Messiah. He was the first person to really get it when Jesus said, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter responded, "I say you are the Messiah." And at that point, Jesus said to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Then, at that point, Jesus told Peter and the disciples that he would have to go to Jerusalem, that he would have to suffer and die and then rise again, which would have been fairly confusing news because they just found out he was the Messiah. They kind of thought this meant like a king, which it does mean a king, but it's not the sort of king they had in mind. So then to find out he's going to have to suffer and die, not really sure what this rise again thing means. There was some confusion. Then Peter, along with James and John, so just the three disciples, witnessed, they're eyewitnesses, they were right there for the transfiguration of Jesus, where they saw the appearance of Moses and Elijah. Remember, Moses was key in that story about the tent and the tabernacle. And at that point, Peter actually heard the audible voice of God saying, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And Peter and James and John had fallen down on the ground, face first and terrified. And then they come back down the mountain. They find the disciples having an argument. Jesus dealt with that. And then Jesus told them again that he was going to have to suffer and die and rise again. So Peter right now is on the other side of some fairly significant life-changing of experiences. I mean, the transfiguration alone is so significant that would change Peter. But he's also trying to process, what does Jesus mean? He said twice now that he's going to die. And he's also said that Jesus also said that Peter is the rock on which the church will be built. So I imagine Peter at this stage is walking around in some sort of haze, like he's kind of in like a spiritual realm almost, just going, oh my gosh, like everything that I thought. Remember, Peter was a fisherman. He was a really down-to-earth, like solid guy that his job was, really practical, go out, fish, come back every day, just the same thing. And now he's like, what is going on? What, like this person that is my friend is also the Messiah, but he's going to die, but I've just seen Moses and Elijah. I think he's just in another world right now. And so they arrive in Capernaum, and this is where the two stories collide and, they meet, because Peter is asked this question by a man who is collecting the temple tax. And the question is, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Now, whenever there is dialogue in the Bible, I always just wish there was a little adverb in there as well. Just a little word to describe how that question is asked. Because if it's asked curiously, like, oh, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? It's really different to if it's asked angrily, like, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? I always just want a little bit more information, but often don't get it. And so we're left having to try and figure out in what tone was this question asked. And I think, given the context that this was a controversial topic, given that it was asked by a tax collector, so that would be someone that is on board with everyone should be paying this tax, I think it's probably like said suspiciously, or I don't know, is weaselly an adverb? Like it's kind of like, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Kind of a way. That wasn't a very good impression. But either way, this tax collector is trying to cause division. Maybe not consciously, but that the question itself is going to cause some division. And notice in particular that he doesn't ask Jesus the question. Jesus was right there. He could have asked Jesus. We see loads of times where people are asking Jesus questions curiously or trying to catch him out. Loads of important people ask Jesus directly to try and find out what his answer is and catch him out. But this tax collector has gone to Peter, has gone to the rock of the church, one of his closest friends, and asked him this question: Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? And he's trying to get in between Peter and Jesus, and Peter answers, yes, he does, and it's like I said, fairly straightforward, mundane thing. But as Peter then enters the house, Jesus asks Peter a question. And so there is obviously more to unpack here. Now, we obviously don't have such a thing as a temple tax anymore, but any church does have costs in order to keep running. We don't have a tent or a temple. We don't have our own building, but it does cost us to rent the space that we use. We employ staff who are working to support and equip people. We've got digital and tech costs. We've buying coffees and drinks and nice refreshments and things. And obviously for all of that, we never tax people. We never say you have to pay this, and I would never ever want to do that. But there is an invitation to give, and we probably don't talk about that enough. But I just want to pause now and give space to have a chat about your view on giving to the church and what that should look like, what that does look like for you, how you figure that out. And this isn't like this is not a trick question. I am not trying to create anything, and I don't want any guilt. There's nothing going on. I just want to open the topic of conversation because I know for some people they've never considered giving, particularly if you've been a student or you've been young and not had any money to give, then it might not be something that's ever crossed your mind what that means to give, what tithing means. Some people think tithing, which is when you give 10%, is the right thing to do. Some people think, oh, that's like an Old Testament thing. I just want to create space for a discussion, and I think this is a really good discussion to have in small groups where you can be honest with each other and open with each other about your journey in giving. Maybe you've got like a little story of hope where you've stepped out in giving and you've seen something, or maybe this is all like brand new to you, and that's absolutely fine. You're really, really welcome to just be where you're at. But I just want to give space now to talk about money and giving in this context of, thank goodness we don't have a temple tax, but then how do we give and be a community that gives? And so Peter enters this house, and Jesus asks Peter, "What do you think about this?" And Jesus says, "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?" And basically what he's saying here is, do kings take money from their own children, from their own sons, or do they take it from the rest of the people? And Peter replies, from the other people, of course, because why would a king take money from his own son? At some point, that son is going to be king, and then it's all going to be his anyway. So why take anything from him? And Jesus agrees, the children are exempt, he said. So what Jesus is saying is he doesn't really have to pay the temple tax because he is the Son of Father God. So he's the Messiah. So why would he essentially pay himself? That doesn't make any sense at all. But what Jesus says next, I think, has a lot of significance. He says, "But so that we may not cause offence, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Now, one of the first things, I noticed a few things here. I actually noticed 4 things that really stand out to me that I think are important. So the first thing is that Jesus uses inclusive language here. So according to Jewish law, Peter should definitely pay the tax. Like whether you think it should be paid by everyone or just men, Peter's a man over the age of 20, so he should pay it. Whether you think whether people thought it should be done annually or just once in a lifetime, Peter should still pay the temple tax. So there's no question around whether Peter should pay it. The only question is around whether Jesus should pay it. Partly as well, that question would have been asked because rabbis were exempt from paying it. So it might have been coming from that angle, like, well, Jesus is a rabbi, is he going to pay it or not? However, when Jesus responds, he says, but so that we may not cause offence. He doesn't say so that I may not cause offence. He says we. So he uses this inclusive language of Peter. So it's we're in this together. And what we need to remember here is that Jesus is doing a new thing. He's not trying to rewrite the story of God, but he's come to fulfill the law. He's not come to change the law, write a new law. He's come to fulfill the Old Testament law. And so this kind of Old Testament way of doing things, Jesus is fulfilling it. And what he's saying is, through recognition of the true King, we are all sons and daughters of God. We're all heirs to the throne. And so if Jesus is exempt from paying it because he is the Son of Father God, then we too are exempt from paying it because we are also in this family through recognising who is the true King. We've also got a share in this kingdom, and therefore Peter also does not owe anything. He doesn't owe temple tax nor anything else. What I also notice here is that Jesus kind of avoids the issue. So what I mean by that is he doesn't get sucked into the issue, and he doesn't want Peter to get sucked in either. Like I said, this tax collector is trying to divide, trying to get Peter to defend or accuse Jesus, trying to trip them up. And Jesus says, actually, none of us need to pay, but let's not cause offence. Now, this isn't the same kind of offence that gets bandied around a lot in this day and age where, we have to be really careful about what we say for fear that it might upset or offend anyone. But it's more like what Jesus is saying is, let's just not create any problems here. It's that kind of offence. Let's not create an issue here. It's not worth it. So in that sense, he's kind of sidestepping the political debate. He's like, no, we don't need to pay it. None of us need to pay it, but let's just pay it. It's not worth having a huge argument and dividing people about. And then finally, what I notice is Jesus keeps Peter focused. he then tells Peter to go to the lake and throw out a line. Now, do you remember when Peter was first called to follow Jesus? It was here at this very lake, and Peter was fishing when he was called. So Jesus is telling Peter to go back to where it first started, to that place where he was first called. And there's some symbolism in there as Jesus guides Peter away from this political divisive issue and into his calling. Remember who you are. Remember what we're here to do. Now, that kind of situation isn't alien to the world we live in. There's all sorts of issues being discussed, issues that cause divide and create upset in people, create division in the church. And I'm not saying that those issues aren't important, but I do think sometimes we can easily get ourselves entangled in these things when maybe we don't need to. Maybe sometimes it's okay to do the thing that will cause less harm, less issue, less problems, and instead remember our first encounter with Jesus, which was usually when our faith was at its simplest. It certainly was for me. My first encounter with Jesus when I was 19 years old, when I went to church for the first time, heard the gospel and decided I believed in Jesus. My faith was absolutely at its simplest. And I think sometimes it's really important to go back to that moment and remember that first simple encounter and calling. Now, I've barely even touched on the most random part of this story, which is that Peter will open the mouth of a fish and find a coin worth 4 drachmas. Now, by the way, a drachma is a Jewish coin. That was the money that had to be paid for the temple tax. And 2 drachmas was the cost of the tax. And it was about like 2 days' salary at the time. So somewhere between £100 and £200, depending on how much you earn. Now, notice we don't ever find out if Peter actually followed those instructions. We see the instructions, we see Jesus telling Peter to go and do this, but we don't know if that miracle ever actually happened, which is really interesting. So maybe this was a metaphor that Jesus used to make a point, or maybe it did happen, but it just didn't get recorded that it happened. But that would be a pretty strange miracle. There's also, it's hard to find evidence if a 4 drachma coin actually existed. So even Jesus saying, and there you'll find a 4 drachma coin, that might be a coin that wasn't really around. Like you could get 1 drachmas and 2 drachmas, but we're not entirely sure if you could get 4 drachmas, but I might be wrong on that. But I think either way, whether that miracle happened or not, I think we can still see that Jesus is showing Peter that everything belongs to God anyway. He's like, don't get caught up in this issue. Don't enter the debate and try and figure it out. Just pay the money, because everything comes from God anyway. It's all God's money anyway. Essentially, when anyone pays it, it's God paying himself, because it's all his money. Everything belongs to him anyway. So here's just a little miracle that would, just make that point. But wherever the money comes from, whether it comes from Peter's own pocket or the mouth of a fish, it's all God's anyway. So to finish, I thought it'd be really good to do what Peter did and go back to that place where we were first called. Now, you might have already done this in your groups, or you might know this, but I'm hoping there'll be some new stuff here where if I ask you to share your story of how you first encountered Jesus, or if you have just grown up knowing Jesus and you can't put a marker on that very first encounter, maybe there's a significant moment for you of where the light bulb moment where you're like, oh, I get it. I really get who Jesus is and who he says I am. So let's just share that in our groups. Just make time to really listen to each other. And then why don't we have a time of prayer at the end of that, where we really give thanks for those encounters and pray blessing on each other in that.